Ambassador Kislyak was born in Moscow, or graduated from the Moscow Engineering Physics Institute in '73 and from the USSR Academy of Foreign Trade in '77. He has a rather long history of serving his nation in Russia in various capacities, and has spent 17 years now, 14 years, or 15 years, okay, I'll get it right yet, in the United States in some capacity or another. He was the second secretary of the Russian permanent mission at the United Nations in New York, where we have a model UN program involved in that part of the diplomatic world. First secretary and consular at the Russian embassy in Washington from 85 to 89, deputy director of the Department of International Science and Technology Cooperation, and director of the Department of Security Affairs and Disarmament. He has served simultaneously both ambassador to Belgium and Russia's permanent representative to NATO in Brussels, and later as Russia's Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. He became ambassador of Russia to the United States in 2008, and so he has been in that capacity now for quite some number of years. He is married, has a daughter, and he's fluent in several languages. I think you'll find his English is about as near native as you're going to find. He speaks excellent Russian, and he is, I can attest that he is a delightful, delightful gentleman with a great embassy and embassy staff. Our Vice President Cam Martin, who intended to be here but had an emergency with a friend with a heart situation and couldn't, he'll show up later, I'm sure, just took 45 students, I think approximately, to the Russian embassy last week and reported back, and the students reported back, that it was absolutely one of the most fabulous experiences they could have had. The Russian embassy and your staff, Mr. Ambassador, were very, very gracious to the students and to our Vice President, and they enjoyed it tremendously. So with that, we welcome Ambassador Kislyak. Please help me welcome him. That's for you.
Thank you, Mr. Butler, for the presentation and for the invitation to speak at this university. It's my second time, and I would say that I enjoy so much being at campuses, and you have a great campus to enjoy as well. And I was walking to this library and watching the students studying and working in the corridors, and I was thinking that how good it is to be a student, and these kids would understand it only in 30 years. That is most probably the best time of their life. And I'm glad that the university has a program inviting people to address issues that are of importance to students and to faculty, and I'm so glad that you invited me also to share some of the thoughts about Russian-American relations today. I understand that you were exempted from the shakeout alarm. Most probably people thought that listening to Russian ambassador would be shaken up. And there will be some shake because the quality of Russian-American relations that you wanted me to address today certainly is not in the best shape. And having served in this country for a long period of time and having been working on US-Russian relations for almost all my diplomatic professional life, I would say that this period most probably is the worst after the end of the Cold War. There are certainly a lot of explanations as to why, and it depends very much as to who you listen to, and I will give you our version. And we are very disappointed with what is happening. And the current events in Ukraine and around Ukraine is just another manifestation, most probably the most explicit manifestation of the difficulties that we have. But the difficulties started even before, and we think unnecessarily so. Some people here in the States say that most probably we are returning into the Cold War. But I would say that we do not believe so. And the reason why is that in the Cold War we had ideological divides between our two countries that were very, very significant, and those was the foundation of all the difficulties that we had and confrontation that we lived through. Currently, Russia is a market economy as much as the United States is. The difference being that you have operated as a market economy for more than 250 years, and Russia is a market only for 25 years. So we are a market economy, and we are very proud of what we have achieved and what we are developing into. But we are a young market economy, which has its pluses, its minuses, but its great future. And Russia has always been so great with its future, and now as well. With the United States, we had lived through a number of ups and downs after the end of the Cold War. I think that there were a lot of expectations about the quality of our relations after the end of the Cold War. And most probably expectations were different here in the States about Russia and in Russia about the United States. I would say that most probably majority of the Russians were thinking that since we have changed because we wanted to change, Americans will become an automatic and immediate friend to us. It didn't work out. The United States also have different view of the world as opposed to Russia, with the notion of exceptionalism that the United States seem to be attributing to themselves. Exceptionalism that gives a ground for ambitions that the United States can tell the others what is right and what is wrong. And when countries have their own views on things that are important, and I have willingness to stand for the things they believe in, that creates significant electricity in our relations. That's exactly what happened. And it's disappointing. It's very disappointing because we think that we do not need return to the Cold War, and we are not planning to. We think that we all stand to gain by working together on big issues that we all face, and I would submit that the absolute majority of important challenges that the United States face are exactly the same as we do. And those are international terrorism, interethnic hatred, interreligious intolerance, economic world crises, and whenever we work together, we have a significantly better chance to succeed than we work against each other. I will give you only a few recent examples, even on the backdrop of the current relations that are not easy. We have been able to work together in the P5+1 negotiating with Iran on a nuclear program of this country that we want to be reassuringly peaceful, and we want it to be fully in compliance with international rules and norms. And I hope that the progress that was achieved so far is a confirmation that negotiating solutions are not only possible, but that's the only way to deal with the problems of this type. And cooperation of Russia and the United States within P5+1 in this respect proved to be not only a significant factor in developing I was telling that even on the backdrop of the difficulties that we lived through, we have been working on significantly more difficult issues than many others. One of them is negotiating. The other one is very practical, very useful, and very timely, I would say. We did work together, United States and Russia, to take all the chemical weapons from Syria and to take them out and to have it eliminated. And prior to that, to get agreement of the Syrian government to sign up to the Convention to Prohibit Chemical Weapons, something that they had never done before, and fully implement this commitment in a very short period of time under conditions of a war. And it was Russia and the United States that initiated all these efforts and have seen to the full completion of the program that proved to be very successful. So I'm returning to what I had been saying, that by working together on important issues, we stand to benefit significantly more than when we have difficulties in our bilateral relations. Now on the difficulties. And I would start with something that most probably isn't related to Ukraine or Snowden or anything controversial. One of the difficulties in our relations were that they are not very mature, in the sense that we certainly have very mature political dialogue with significant traditions, with significant history, with the excellent professionals involved. But when you look at the Russian-American relations, they are very limited in interaction between the societies. What I have in mind is, first and foremost, the economic relations between our two countries. And that has been the case since the 90s. It's still the case today. And I will tell you that at the peak, the highest numbers for Russian-American trade, it was 2 years ago, was $39 billion worth of trade both ways, export and import for these countries. It's American statistics. Our statistics shows even lower figures, somewhere 29, because they count differently. But one way or another, what is $39 billion? It's less than 1% of the foreign trade of the United States. $39 billion doesn't put United States as a list of the most important countries in terms of economic relations for Russia. Just to compare, your trade with the EU, as far as I remember, is more than $600 billion direct trade. Our trade with EU is about 450 plus minus billion euros. Yours is in dollars, ours in euros. And it's very much comparable, you see. But between us, it's miserably low. What is involved here is not only the benefits that business people get from working in market of each other. It's also a mechanism to establish partnerships where people work together, when they develop ties, when they understand each other and understand each other's societies pretty well. And also understanding what the other country is and what the other country is not, which I think is also very important, because after the end of the Cold War, the stereotypes of the Cold War were still and still are haunting us. And there are so many misperceptions and mispresentations that are governing our national decisions that I, for example, as ambassador here in this country, witness almost each and every day. And it's also part of our relationship. I would tell you that during the last maybe 5 years, maybe 4 years, I don't recollect any major exchanges between the lawmakers of this, both countries. And I would submit that it's not because ours didn't want to. We do not have any exchange programs between the court systems of these two countries. However, even in the Soviet Union times, in the Cold War, there were a number of programs that were bringing together professionals. We had developed a mechanism to help to develop these relations, and that was formed by then President Medvedev and President Obama by establishing a presidential commission that had 21 subcommissions that were co-chaired on the level of cabinet members or sub-cabinet level on both countries. And they were covering almost everything under the sun, starting from military to military and ending with sports, culture, and everything in between, predominantly on economy. And the idea was to give a boost to all these relations. Now, with the significant difficulties that we are going through in Russian-American relations, this commission was discontinued, not by us, it was a decision by the United States government, and we do not have any substantive systemic dialogue on majority of the issues that are important. So what is left is diplomatic channels that are working as always professionally, but the interaction between societies that do form texture of relations with, say, Russia, with other countries in Europe or in Asia, it's largely undercut in our relations with the United States. Sometimes I'm amazed how few connections we have, even physically speaking. You know, if you live in Alaska and want to go to far east of Russia, you will have to take a plane to Seoul, Shanghai, or Tokyo first, and they fly back to north to Vladivostok. There are no air connections, no sea lines connecting Russia and the United States. There is almost no trade. I spoke to the governor of Alaska several years ago, and his assessment was that the trade between us was about $11 million. And it's in a situation where we are so close, and most probably many people here in here in the States and in Russia as well do not understand how close neighbors we are. The distance between us and the United States in the Northern Pacific, the shortest distance, is only 3 kilometers. And people here in the States, when they think about Russia, usually mentally look to the east. When you talk in Moscow about the United States, people instinctively will be looking to the west. However, if you look to the east, the United States is our close neighbor. And if you talk to people who live in Alaska about Russia, they all are suggesting that those are our western neighbors. It's amazing how many things that potentially can give us significant channels of communications and programs to work on together, and we miss so many opportunities in the past and missing now. But certainly what is defining our relations now are significant differences of view. I will briefly say that we felt that this relation started getting towards even before Ukrainian events. You might wish to remember the atmosphere here, for example, on the eve of elections, of Olympics in Sochi. How much was discussed here in a very, I would say, offensive way about Russia, Russian domestic policies, which by and large wasn't true. And in the very end, people were suggesting that it wasn't safe enough for Americans to go to Russia. That was something I was amazed with. But the Olympics went well. They considered to be among the best in the history of Winter Olympics. And I think people in Salt Lake City understand how big an enterprise Olympics are. And we even won the Olympics that we are very much proud of. Then we had the events around Mr. Snowden, who happened to be in the airport of Russia without visa to go to Russia, or because he had never asked for one, and without valid passport because the United States government chose to revoke his passport when he was arriving to Sheremetyevo airport next to Moscow. So he got stuck, and it wasn't on our invitation. And there was no way, legal, political, that we would extradite this person who hasn't committed any crime in Russia, because we didn't have any legal instruments with the United States for extradition. However, we had proposed it to the US many times in the past, and it was never agreed to by the US governments, consecutive governments. And you remember, as a result, the President of the United States decided to cancel the bilateral summit, and that certainly didn't help the cordiality in our relations either. We certainly can survive without all this. You can survive without this. But I repeat once again that there are so many challenges in the world that we can address together significantly better than if we work against each other. And currently, Ukraine. Ukraine is an issue that most probably, like in an optical focus, brought together all the difficulties that we used to have in the relations with the United States and some of the Western countries. And it was so difficult for us because we are talking about a country that we consider to be a sister, brother country, whatever you call it. We are so intertwined. We cannot be indifferent to what is happening to the people there. And we have significantly different assessment with the US as to what occurred in Ukraine, what occurred in Kyiv. Because we believe that what happened there was a forceful overthrow of legitimately elected government in Ukraine. The government that had been elected by people of Ukraine, that was congratulated upon elections by the United States and absolute majority of the European countries. And we saw it forcefully overthrown, and the United States chose to support that kind of process and what happened afterwards, and we didn't. And sometimes when I read the press here, discuss with many people in the States, people perceive it and portray the whole situation around Ukraine almost as a kind of confrontation between Russian leadership and American leadership. It's not. Some portray it as a confrontation between Russia and Ukraine. It's not. The core problem in Ukraine that we understand, the way we understand, and I hope that's going to be proven by history, is between those who took over in Kyiv, took over the power instruments in Kyiv, and some of the regions of the country that do not accept this change. So we have been saying insistently, when we talk to Ukrainian government, with our Western interlocutors, that what is important in order to fix all the problems in Ukraine and around Ukraine is to make the government in Ukraine to talk, to negotiate, and to agree with their own people. And it didn't occur. It didn't occur even now after numerous commitments by Kyiv to engage in a constitutional change that would be all-inclusive, in addressing a number of laws that would guarantee the use of languages, that would give the rights of all the minorities to live the way that would be certainly compatible with the Ukrainian constitution, but certainly protect the ethnic feelings. What happened is that when people are in eastern part, and Crimea even more so, because majority of people living in Crimea are Russians ethnically, when they protested against the forceful change of guard in Kyiv, that it's not only a change of personalities, it's a change of direction the country takes. And I do not buy an argument that Ukraine, by overthrowing a president, has chosen European values. What is actually was happening, still happening there, is hardly compatible with European values. What we saw happening was extreme nationalist forces that did the forceful component of this revolution that started mainly on the basis of legitimate discontent of the people of Ukraine with some actions of the government. And if you remember the first reports from Maidan, that's the main square in Kyiv, where protests were undertaken, it was peaceful. But then we saw a number of people, well-trained, well-prepared, well-organized, who entered the square, who started throwing Molotov cocktails on police forces. And all of this led to a death of people in the streets, and also with the paralysis of the government in Kiev. But it's something that is based sometimes on a very, very one-sided nationalistic view of the future for Ukraine. And if you remember the very first draft law that was adopted, however, never got in full force, it was a law to prohibit effectively to prohibit languages other than Ukrainian in Ukraine. And that was a very powerful signal to the rest of the country and to the minorities as to what this revolution, as they call it, all is about. And that's why these people were not in agreement, that's why they protested. And instead of working with the citizens, working to develop the concept for the future of Ukraine that will be all-inclusive, we saw the government in Kiev labeling these people separatists, terrorists, and starting what they call anti-terrorist operation, which in fact is a war against their own people. That is the biggest problem in Ukraine, and if we can find solutions, and solutions only can be peaceful through negotiations, I think many other things will fall in a rightful place, including Russian-American relations as well. But so far, currently, what we see happening is that we still disagree on how to help Ukrainians to find mutual accommodations. However, there is a process of negotiations, the so-called Minsk process, Minsk group, that came up with some preliminary solutions, one of the most important one being cessation of hostilities, which is not fully complied with, but by and large is working, and the situation has become markedly more peaceful. But what is important now, that all the mechanism of negotiations, consultations started in order to solve economic problems, linguistic problems, and how the development of a concept for the whole country, how it best to be organized on the basis of constitution that is yet to be discussed and yet to be adopted. In the meantime, the United States introduced sanctions against Russia for our support of these processes on the Russian side. We saw sanctions introduced against Russia, economic sanctions. Most probably you've heard, as I did, these suggestions that the United States and the West will make Russia isolated, that the economy is going to be undermined. So the whole set of tools and instruments to work on this issue was pressure, 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 nothing else. It doesn't work against Russia. We are not going to accept that kind of language. And we certainly will survive whatever sanctions are introduced or have been introduced. I would tell you that Russia is one of the biggest economies in the world, either 6th or 7th, depending on how you count. We are self-sufficient in everything. Our microeconomic situation, irrespective of difficulties that we go through, is among the most healthy in Europe. I'll give you just a couple of figures that our national debt is less than 10% of GNP. And if you compare it with that, say, of Germany, Italy, France, or Spain, it's 10 times less or 15 times less in relative terms. We have unemployment only on a level of 5%, which is comparable with that with the United States, but much better than anything that you can see in Europe. We have still significant reserves. Currently, it's about less than $400 billion. That certainly can and are used in order to keep the economy stable. What we are suffering from are not necessarily from these sanctions. However, they are not helpful. But rather the drop in prices in oil and gas and our own delays in modernizing economy and leaving it over-dependent on export of oil and gas. That's why it has become so vulnerable. Well, the prices went down. The idea of modernization of the economy, that means making best use of wealth of technology and science that is available in Russia to put it to the best use for the economic development, is something that we have been talking about for quite a long period of time. But we didn't do much and fast enough, because we are blessed to have so much of resources that nobody felt very much pressed. Currently, the situation is changing. And there are a number of specialists who say that as a result of the current difficulties and even sanctions, we will restart something and that we had been talking about and not fully implementing for a significant period of time. And as a result, we will become stronger. I believe in that notion. And there are very first figures that show that the economy is stabilizing, even on the backdrop of the low sanctions, low prices of oil and gas. Ruble has stabilized. It, as our financial specialists say, it has found its balance. And the economy is returning to normal state. We believe that before the end of this year, we will see some lowering of GNP by 1 or 2%, but starting the end of the year and in 2016, we will be back on the track of growth, and I hope very stable and predictable. So on the sanctions, they certainly do not help, especially on the backdrop of the current economic challenges on the world market. But it's not the first time that sanctions were introduced against Russia. The very first ones, for those who didn't study Russian history, was in the 20s, when the United States decided not to allow Russia, Soviet Russia at the time, to use gold reserves for purchase of goods in the West. Since currency in post-revolutionary Russia wasn't available, what was used to pay for the things that we were buying was the gold. It didn't work. We survived and we became stronger. The last strong sanctions before this one was in '81, when the United States and Western countries introduced a ban of supply of tubes for pipelines from Urengoy to the western border of Russia. It was for political reasons, and the punishment was done more to the Western companies working with us than to Russian economy. And mind you, the pipeline was successfully built. It has been in works for several decades, and it's one of the sources of our income. And moreover today, and it's amazing, there is a company, #1 in the world, producing industrial tubes for Russian oil and gas industry and for American oil and gas industry, and it's called TMK. It's #1 in the world. It's the best product available, even for the shell production here in the States. That is a significant competitor to us. But nevertheless, business is business. A Russian company is so successful. And most probably one of the reasons why that we felt that we have to develop national capacity instead of relying on trade and the globalization that was promoted as the main framework for mutual economic development. I would add to this only one thing, that sanctions, they are not going to change Russian policies, but what is changing is the trust in the globalization and a trust in the WTO principles of open trade, because we saw once again that all these agreements, understandings, statements about commitment of states to free trade and free movement of capital can be easily hijacked by political differences. Because what happened, we have a political difference, but the instrument of pressure on Russia was economic. So businesses were punished. And the predictability and reliability of the long-term ties in economics with Western countries has been put under the question mark. We also see that overdependence of the world markets on a dollar system of payments is also vulnerable to unilateral decisions. And those who study world economics must probably see that there are so many new instruments popping up throughout the world that specifically try to avoid reliance on a dollar monopoly. The Chinese friends are starting a very significant bank of investment. We are going to be part of it. The BRICS countries have started a bank of its own with initial capital of $100 billion worth. And we see more and more countries agreeing between themselves to do trade, avoiding dollars as a payment system. Russia is part of these countries, but not only the only one. And there are many, many more, because they are watching what is happening and understand that the overall system of trade, economic relations has become so vulnerable to a political decisions that has nothing to do with economic development. So it's disappointing, all of this. But I will end my presentation by what I started. It's unnecessary. I'm sure we are not going back to the Cold War, at least Russia isn't going to help this. You might have seen that we didn't introduce counter-sanctions because we didn't want businesses to be punished for things that they are not part of. We believe that there will be found political solutions to the crises that put us apart. And we believe that normalcy in the relations between Russia and the United States need and can be restored. We are not going to walk around and beg for dialogues or trade if the United States doesn't want it. But I think that the history and economic realities will push relations to bigger normalcy. That is something that is needed not only for our economy, it's needed for yours, and what is important for the world stability as well, because Russia and the United States are still among the major nuclear powers, members of the Security Council, and there are a lot of things that depend very much on the ability of our two countries to work together. The question is how long it's going to take, and whether we will be able to preserve enough of positive that had been achieved between our two countries in order to create a good basis for expansion of this normalcy in our relations. And we as an embassy work in order to maintain this kind of possibilities and work with our American colleagues towards better understanding and I would say creating instruments for a return to the normalcy. So thank you, and I will be open for Q&A.